The morning Milton Sutton rode back into Redemption Creek. The town smelled like someone else's breakfast and the ghost of everything he had lost. He had been gone 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Not that he was counting, except that he was, the way a man counts the things that keep him honest about his own ruin. He rode in on a dusty roan mare named Clover who had seen better days, same as her rider, and he kept his hat pulled low against the October sun of 1882, as though the brim alone could shield him from the memories that clung to this place like smoke clings to wool. Redemption Creek sat in the hill country of central Texas, a town of maybe 400 souls if you counted generously, and did not ask too many questions about where certain men had come from or why. The main street was packed dirt and ambition, lined with a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Dusty Spur, a church that leaned slightly to the left as though even God found this place a little crooked, and various other establishments that had sprouted up in the years since the railroad spur had extended its reach this far west. It was not a beautiful town, but it was a town that kept its word about most things, and in 1882 that counted for something. Milton was 29 years old and looked every year of it, plus a few that did not belong to him. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, with dark hair gone a little long beneath his hat, and eyes the color of creek water in shade, a gray-green that people tended to remember without quite knowing why. There was a scar along his left jaw, thin and pale now, from the night 3 years ago when everything he had built had burned to the ground. He did not let himself think about the fire unless he had to. He had come back to Redemption Creek because he had run out of places to go that were not here, and because his old friend Caleb Ray's had written him a letter saying there was a parcel of land going cheap outside of town, a small place, enough acreage to run some cattle and maybe do something with himself again. Caleb had not said come home because Caleb knew better than to use that word. He had just said the land was there, the price was fair, and the rest was Milton's business. So Milton had come. He did not look at the eastern end of town as he rode in. He did not look at the blackened foundation that still sat there, half reclaimed by scrub grass and stubbornness, because he had built that house with his own hands at 23 years old, and he had watched it burn from the road while the volunteer bucket line did what it could, and it was not enough. He did not look at it, and he did not think about his wife Clara's blue dress hanging on the line beside it, which had not burned because the fire had started on the other side, and which someone had presumably taken down at some point, though he had not stayed to see. Clara had died in that fire. He did not let himself think about it. He tied Clover outside the Dusty Spur and went in for a drink, because some rituals are necessary even when they bring no comfort, and the man behind the bar was younger than Milton had expected, a fellow with a red kerchief and a friendly enough face, which was almost a relief. He ordered whiskey, drank it slowly, and listened to the bar conversation around him, which concerned itself primarily with a dispute between 2 ranchers over water rights on the South Fork of Redemption Creek, and secondarily with the upcoming harvest dance, which was apparently being organized by the Ladies' Auxiliary, and was expected to draw more attendance than last year on account of the new fiddle player that Harmon Wells had hired away from a dance hall in San Antonio. Neither topic required Milton's participation, which suited him fine. He finished his drink, paid, and rode out to find Caleb. Caleb Ray's was 31, Mexican-American, and had been Milton's closest friend since they were boys running cattle together for the Dawson spread back, when Redemption Creek was barely a whistle stop. He had a wife named Rosa and 3 children and a small farm on the north side of town, and when he saw Milton coming up his road, he walked out to meet him with his arms open like a man who had been watching the horizon for exactly that shape of rider. "You look terrible," Caleb said. "I appreciate the honesty," Milton said, and let himself be pulled into a brief, hard embrace that he was not entirely prepared for. Something in his chest cracked a little, like ice in spring. "Rosa is making tamales," Caleb said. "You'll stay for supper. I wasn't planning to impose. You weren't planning a lot of things. Come inside. They sat on Caleb's porch that evening after supper, the children put to bed, Rosa gone in to sew by lamplight, and Caleb talked Milton through the details of the Hargrove parcel, 12 acres, a small house that needed work, a barn that was sound, a creek running through the south edge. The previous owner had gone north after his wife died, and his heart was not in ranching anymore. The land was priced to sell. "You'll want to see it tomorrow," Caleb said. "There's something about the view from the back hill that'll settle you, if anything can." Milton looked out at the dark and said, "I'm not sure settling is what I'm looking for." "What are you looking for?" He was quiet for a long time. The cicadas were loud and the night was warm for October. "Something to do with my hands," he said finally. "That's all." Caleb nodded, because he was a wise enough man to accept that and not press further. Milton bought the Hargrove parcel 2 days later. He paid in cash. The result of 3 years of working other men's cattle drives and sleeping on hard ground and spending almost nothing because there was nothing he wanted, and the transaction was handled through the bank without ceremony. He moved into the small house with what he owned, which fit in a single saddlebag and a bedroll, and he set to work. The house needed a new porch step. The roof had a leak above the second room. The barn needed its hinge replaced on the large door. The well rope had rotted through. Milton worked on these things methodically, one at a time, rising before dawn and working until the light failed. Eating simple food he made himself with minimal interest in the eating of it, and falling asleep on his bedroll each night too tired to dream much. This was the life he had built for himself after the fire. Not a life so much as an occupation. Not a future so much as a series of tasks that kept him from having to want anything. He had not let himself want anything since the fire. Wanting things was how you ended up standing in a road watching everything burn. He was aware, in a distant way, that this philosophy was not entirely healthy. But it was functional, and functional was enough. The Hargrove place, his place now, though he had trouble thinking of it that way, sat about a quarter-mile south of the main Redemption Creek Road, accessible by a dirt track that curved through a stand of live oaks before opening up onto the property. To the east of him, about 300 yards, there was another farm. He had not paid it much attention initially, being occupied with his own repairs, but on his fourth morning he noticed smoke rising from its chimney at an unusual hour very early, before the sun was fully up, and the smell that came with the smoke was something that made him stop where he stood with his hammer in his hand and stand there like a fool. It smelled like cornbread. He did not do anything about it. He went back to his porch step, but he noticed. The following Sunday, Caleb dragged him to church, because Caleb believed in community the way some men believe in water rights, absolutely and with practical conviction. Milton sat in the third pew and stared at the minister's left shoulder and did not sing the hymns, but he was there, which was apparently enough for Caleb. It was after the service, in the yard outside the church where people gathered to talk in that particular Sunday way that makes even simple conversation feel slightly ceremonial, that Caleb introduced him to some of the neighbors he had not yet met. There were several ranchers, a couple of farmwives, the new schoolteacher, and lastly, a woman who was standing slightly apart from the main group with a basket over her arm and a look on her face that suggested she was deciding whether to stay or go. "Georgia Turner," Caleb said, bringing Milton over. "She's got the farm just east of yours. Came here about 2 years ago from Virginia. Georgia, this is Milton Sutton. He's just bought the Hargrove place." Georgia Turner turned to look at him, and Milton experienced the disconcerting sensation of meeting someone's eyes and finding them more direct than he was prepared for. She was 25 or 26, he guessed, with dark brown hair pinned up under a plain bonnet, and a face that was neither conventionally pretty nor easily forgotten, strong-jawed, clear-eyed, with a mouth that seemed to be deciding between several things at once. Her hands, when she extended one for a handshake, were the hands of someone who worked hard and did not apologize for it. She was wearing a sensible gray dress that had been mended at the left sleeve, and she smelled like wood smoke and something sweet molasses, perhaps. "Mr. Sutton," she said. Her voice was clear and slightly lower than he expected, with the faintest trace of a Virginia accent softened by 2 years of Texas. "Miss Turner," he said, "or Mrs." "Miss," she said, without any particular inflection that indicated this was a sensitive matter. "I farm the east property alone. I understand you'll be running cattle. That's the plan. Your south fence needs work," she said. "The Hargrove cattle got into my garden twice last spring. I'd appreciate it if you could see to that." It was said without hostility, purely practical, and he found it oddly refreshing. "I'll see to it this week," he said. "Thank you," she said, and turned to speak with Rosa Reyes, who had come up beside her with one of her children on her hip. Milton watched her for a moment, just a moment, and then looked away. He fixed the south fence that Tuesday. Life in Redemption Creek resumed its rhythms around him, and Milton allowed himself to be carried along by them without quite participating. He bought 3 cattle from a man named Hoskins, a tough little herd that he planned to expand gradually. He learned that the general store was run by a man named Delbert Foss, who had strong opinions about everything and would share them without much prompting. He reestablished a nodding acquaintance with the blacksmith, a massive, quiet man called Owen, who had been in town even before Milton's first time here, and who did not seem to find Milton's reappearance remarkable in any direction. He did not go near the eastern end of town. He found routes that avoided it. The days grew shorter and the nights cooler, and Milton settled into something that was not quite comfort but was at least predictable. He rose before dawn, worked his land, rode into town for supplies when necessary, spoke to people when spoken to, and asked nothing of anyone that was not strictly practical. It was a life shaped entirely around avoiding the possibility of loss, which meant also avoiding the possibility of gain, which he understood at some level was a problem, but which he had not yet found the energy to address. Then, on a Thursday morning in the second week of November, he woke to find something on his windowsill. He almost missed it. He had come downstairs in the gray pre-dawn to start the stove and check on Clover, and it was only when he passed the east-facing window that he saw the shape of it, a cloth-wrapped bundle sitting neatly on the sill, tied with a piece of kitchen twine. He stopped. He stood there in the cold kitchen in his stocking feet and stared at it the way a man stares at something he is not sure is real. He opened the window and took it in. It was cornbread, still faintly warm. Square cut, golden at the edges, wrapped in a clean piece of muslin. There was no note. He stood in the kitchen holding this small, warm, inexplicable thing and felt something move in him that he could not immediately name. It was not quite emotion. He had been keeping emotion at a careful distance, but it was something in the neighborhood of it. Some disturbance in the organized blankness he had been cultivating. He set the cornbread on the table. He made his coffee. He sat down, and after a long moment he unwrapped it and ate it. And it was the best cornbread he had eaten in he could not say how long, light and slightly sweet with a crisp underside. And he ate every piece of it, and then sat there looking at the empty muslin and felt the unsettling beginnings of something he did not want to examine too closely. He could not stop thinking about it. Not about the cornbread exactly, but about the gesture. The smallness of it, the thoughtfulness. Someone had risen before dawn, the smoke from the east chimney, he realized, the smoke he had noticed on his 4th morning and baked cornbread and brought it silently to his windowsill, had not knocked, had not announced themselves, had simply left something good and warm in the early dark and gone back home. He told himself it was a neighborly custom. He told himself he was reading nothing into it. He thought about it all day. By evening he had convinced himself he was not going to say anything about it, because saying something would make it a thing, and he did not want it to be a thing. He would simply not acknowledge it, and the moment would pass and he would go back to being exactly as empty as he had arranged to be. The following Thursday morning, there was another package on his windowsill. Cornbread again. this time with a small pot of what turned out to be sorghum molasses, a little clay pot with a cork stopper, placed beside the cloth-wrapped bread like a considered companion. Milton sat with this for even longer. He ate the cornbread with the molasses, which was very good, and he thought about the east chimney, and he thought about Georgia Turner's direct eyes and her mended sleeve and her voice telling him his south fence needed work. And he thought that he had now officially reached the point where he needed to say something or else become a man who collected mysterious cornbread in silence, which was not the sort of man he wanted to be. He waited until mid-morning and then rode Clover the 300 yards east along the fence line to Georgia Turner's farm. Her place was tidy in the way of someone who works alone and has organized necessity into a kind of order. The house was slightly smaller than his, well kept, with dried herbs hanging under the eave of the porch, and a kitchen garden to the south still showing the late-season remnants of collard greens and turnips. A milk cow was in the small paddock. Chickens ranged freely in the yard, and one of them walked directly under Clover's feet with majestic indifference. Georgia Turner came out of the barn with a bucket in each hand before Milton had a chance to knock, and she stopped when she saw him and set the buckets down with the economical movement of someone who was not startled, or at least did not show it. "Mr. Sutton," she said. "Miss Turner." He got down from Clover. "I wanted to thank you for the cornbread." She looked at him steadily. "Did you like it?" "I did," he said, "both times." Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the edge of one contained. "I make it most Thursday mornings," she said. "I tend to make too much for one person. It seemed a waste to let it go." He understood this was an explanation given for his benefit and possibly not the complete truth, and he found that he did not mind either of those things. "It was kind of you," he said. "It's just cornbread," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, still. There was a pause in which neither of them said anything, and the chicken went back and forth between them with great conviction, and the milk cow regarded them from the paddock. "How are you finding the Hargrove place?" she asked. "I've fixed most of what needed fixing," he said, "the south fence especially." "I noticed," she said. "Thank you for that." "I'll start on the cattle expansion in spring," he said, though he was not sure why he was telling her his plans. He was not in the habit of telling anyone his plans. "There's good grazing on the back 40 if you can get water to it," she said. "I found that out last summer. The creek sometimes doesn't reach as far as you'd think." "Good to know," he said. He should have left then. He had said thank you, she had acknowledged the gift, the exchange was complete. But he stood there in the thin November sunlight for another moment and found he did not particularly want to leave, which was itself such a remarkable and unwelcome discovery that it took him a moment to recover from it. "I'll let you get back to your work," he said. "I am fairly busy," she agreed, but there was something in her voice that was not unwelcoming, a kind of door left not quite closed. He rode home and spent the rest of the day thinking about her, and then spent the evening being annoyed at himself for thinking about her, and then spent the following day thinking about her again, which suggested that annoyance was not going to be sufficient. November deepened. He threw himself into the business of the farm, repairing the barn roof before the winter rains, expanding the small tack room, building a better feed rack for the cattle, cutting wood. He went into town twice a week, and accumulated a small list of acquaintances that stopped short of friendship except for Caleb, with whom he had supper every Sunday at Rose's insistence. The cornbread continued to appear on his windowsill every Thursday morning. He began to look forward to it with an intensity that bothered him. The fourth Thursday, there was a small folded piece of paper tucked under the twine. He unfolded it and read in a clear, slightly angular handwriting, "The molasses ran out. I used honey this time. I hope that is acceptable." He read the note 3 times. He was aware that this was an entirely disproportionate response to a note about honey. He got up, went to the barn, did 40 minutes of unnecessary work, came back inside, and read the note again. He thought for a long time about whether to write back. He sat at the small table with a scrap of paper and a pencil stub and wrote, "The honey is fine. Better than fine. Thank you, M. Sutton. He crossed that out because it sounded cold. He wrote, the honey is excellent, thank you kindly, M. Sutton. He crossed that out because it sounded formal to the point of unfriendliness. He wrote finally, I didn't think it was possible to improve on the original, but I was wrong. Thank you, M. Sutton. He folded the paper and walked it over to her property and left it on her porch step that afternoon, and rode home feeling like a damn fool, which was, he noticed, not entirely unpleasant. Georgia Turner read the note that evening by her kitchen lamp, and she read it twice, and she allowed herself a smile that no one was there to see. She had come to Redemption Creek 2 years earlier from a small farm in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, following the death of her father, and the decision made alone on a cold January morning, with the farm's debts stacked on the kitchen table in front of her, that starting fresh somewhere else was more honest than pretending the life she had was still viable. She had read about homestead land in Texas in a newspaper left on the stagecoach, and she had taken the stage and the train and eventually a mule cart, and she had arrived in Redemption Creek on a rainy April afternoon with a trunk, a seed box, a set of good cast iron pans, and the absolute conviction that she was either the bravest or the stupidest woman in the state of Texas, and that time would tell which. 2 years in, she was inclined to say brave. The farm was producing. She had her milk cow, her chickens, her kitchen garden, and a small field of winter wheat that was showing itself to be more cooperative than she had initially feared. She had made friends, Rosa Rays, who was warm and practical and funny, and a few of the other women in town, and the minister's wife who ran a small lending library from her parlor that Georgia visited every second week. She was, she would have said, content. Not entirely without loneliness. That was honest, but content in the way of a person who has built something with their own hands and knows its worth. When the Hargrove place sold and Caleb mentioned the new neighbor, she had observed the property from a polite distance, noticing the early morning smoke, the methodical sound of repair work carrying across in the still November air, the single horse in the paddock, the single figure working alone. She had asked Rosa about him, casually, and Rosa had been slightly less than casual in her answer, saying, Milton Sutton is a good man who has had a hard time and does not always know what is good for him, which Georgia recognized as the kind of thing a loving friend says when they mean something more specific but are being discreet. She had taken the cornbread over on impulse the first Thursday, telling herself it was purely neighborly, which it was. She had taken it back the second Thursday because it occurred to her that once could be impulse but twice was a choice, and she had decided the choice was worth making, which was a different thing. The note changed things slightly. Not dramatically, not in a way that required action, but in the way a door opening a little changes the pressure in a room. She could feel from the particular care of his words, I didn't think it was possible to improve on the original, that there was a thoughtful man on the other side of the exchange who was perhaps not quite as closed as he appeared. She thought about that, and then she put the thought away because she was a practical person and she had a farm to run and it was November and the winter wheat needed attention. But she thought about it. The harvest dance arrived in the 3rd week of November, on a Saturday evening in the Redemption Creek Community Hall, and Caleb informed Milton 2 days beforehand that he was expected to attend, as though attendance were already a settled matter requiring only notification. Milton attempted to decline, and Caleb was impervious to the attempt. Rosa told Milton that she had spoken to Georgia Turner and that Georgia would also be attending, which Rosa delivered in the tone of a woman providing purely informational context, though her eyes said otherwise. Milton arrived at the community hall at 7 o'clock looking like a man who had ironed his shirt with more care than he was prepared to admit, which was the truth. The hall was loud and warm and hung with dried corn and late fall flowers, and the fiddle player from San Antonio was already earning his reputation. A young Mexican man named Eduardo who played with a kind of joyful precision that made even people who claimed not to enjoy dancing reconsider their position. He spotted Georgia Turner across the room, about 40 seconds after he walked in. She was standing with Rosa and a couple of other women, and she was wearing a green dress. He noted this the way a man notes a thing that catches him off guard, involuntarily and with some force. It was not a fancy dress, but it was a good color on her, and her hair was down from the tight workday knot and pinned more loosely, and she was laughing at something Rosa had said, and Milton stood just inside the doorway and felt the room recede around him in the particular way a room recedes when you have stopped being able to give your full attention to anything else in it. He got himself a cup of cider and talked to Caleb and Hoskins, the cattle man, and the blacksmith Owen for a period that was long enough to suggest he was in no hurry, which was not entirely true. Eventually the dancing started in earnest and the room reorganized itself around the music, and he found himself drifting, somewhat inevitably, to where Georgia Turner stood. "Miss Turner," he said. "Mr. Sutton." She looked at him with those direct eyes. "You came." "Caleb is persuasive," he said. "He is," she agreed. "He told Rosa to tell me that you would be here, which I suspect was not an accident." "Probably not," Milton said. "He means well," Georgia said. "He does," Milton agreed, and they both stood there for a moment in the warm music-cloud room, holding this mutual acknowledgement that their friend had been matchmaking with the subtlety of a freight train, and the acknowledgement was not unpleasant. "Would you like to dance?" he said. The words came out more directly than he had planned because he had not planned to say them, and yet there they were. Georgia Turner looked at him for a moment. "I should tell you," she said, "that I am not a graceful dancer." "I'm not either," he said. "Then we'll be even," she said, and took the arm he offered. They danced a reel, which forgave most errors through the simplicity of its pattern, and she had not been lying about the grace, and neither had he, and at some point in the second turn they both laughed at a mutual stumble, and that laughter was unexpectedly easy, the kind that does not perform itself but just happens. He noticed the warmth of her hand through his sleeve and the way she moved with a kind of determined competence, the same way she apparently did most things. They danced twice. He did not push for a third because he could feel himself at the edge of something he was not ready to cross, and he was not sure she was ready either, and he was more careful with her than he had been with anything in a long time without quite realizing he was being careful. They stood by the cider table afterward and actually talked, not the careful practical exchange of fence lines and cornbread. And he learned that she had a brother still in Virginia named Thomas who wrote infrequently, that she had read almost everything in the minister's wife's lending library and had opinions about most of it, that she had once worked a field in a thunderstorm because she refused to let 3 hours of planting go to waste, and that she had been in Redemption Creek long enough to know most of its business and to have decided which parts of it were worth caring about. She learned that he had grown up in this part of Texas, that he could shoe a horse as well as Owen the blacksmith, though he would never say so to Owen's face, that he had once driven cattle all the way up to Dodge City and found Kansas both flatter and more interesting than expected, and that he took his coffee with no sugar and 2 things he was not yet going to talk about. She did not push on the 2 things, which he noticed. They walked out into the cool night air at some point because the hall had grown hot, and they stood on the narrow porch of the community hall and looked at the stars, which were very clear and many, the way Texas stars are in November, and they did not talk for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. "Can I ask you something?" Georgia said. "You can," he said. "Why did you come back here? Caleb's land offer aside, you could have started over anywhere." He was quiet for a moment. "I suppose I thought I had to come back and look at it before I could go anywhere else," he said. "Does that make sense?" "Look at what?" He turned his cup of cider slightly in his hands. "There was a fire," he said. 3 years ago I lost my house, I lost my wife." He said the words flat and careful, the way you carry something that might break. "I left right after, spent 3 years going other places and being other things, but I think I needed to come back here first." Georgia was quiet. She did not fill the silence with condolences or questions, and he was grateful for that. "I'm sorry," she said finally simply, and the simplicity of it was exactly right. "It was a long time ago," he said, which was not the same as saying it was over, and she seemed to understand the difference. "I came here for similar reasons in a way," she said. "Not a fire, but starting over. Deciding the life you had was one you couldn't go back to." "Does it get easier?" he said. "The starting over." She considered this seriously. "It becomes more familiar," she said, "which I think is different from easier, but maybe just as good." He looked at her, and she was looking at the stars, and her profile in the community hall light was clear and quiet, and he felt something he had not felt in 3 years, something that was not quite hope, but was in the same territory, the place on the map just before you reach hope if you keep walking. He did not say anything about it, but he noticed it, and unlike most things he noticed, he did not immediately work to extinguish it. He walked her to her horse that evening. She rode her own horse to town, a steady bay she called Pepper, and said good night with his hat in his hands like a man who had temporarily forgotten how to put it back on. She rode home smiling to herself in the dark and told herself not to make too much of it, which was advice she was not entirely capable of following. December arrived with cold nights and clear days, and Milton found his weeks restructured around Thursdays in a way he was almost willing to admit to himself. The cornbread continued to arrive. Sometimes there were additions, a small pot of beans one week, a paper cone of roasted pecans another, a jar of apple butter the week before Christmas that was so good he ate half of it standing at the counter and was not sorry. He wrote back on the paper every time. Short notes, practical at first, gradually becoming less so. He told her the pecans were the best thing he had eaten since Rose's tamales, which he recognized was saying something. She wrote back to tell him the apple butter recipe had been her mother's, and that she made it every December and had been doubtful about Texas apples, but had been converted. He told her that Texas had a way of converting people to things they had been doubtful about. She wrote back, "Is that a compliment to Texas or a warning about it?" He wrote, "Yes." She kept that note in the small box on her dresser where she kept things worth keeping. He was aware that he was courting her, in the imprecise roundabout way of two people who are not yet quite saying so, and the awareness was not the source of terror he might have expected. There was something about Georgia Turner that did not require the performance of certainty. She was too honest for performance, which meant he did not have to perform either, which meant that the thing building between them was building on actual ground rather than hope and presentation, and this was, he thought, the safest kind of building. Safe was perhaps the wrong word. He was more alive around her than he had been in 3 years, and alive was not the same as safe. He felt things more sharply. The cold felt colder, the stars brighter, the coffee better. He found himself doing unnecessary repairs on the barn, just to have something to do with the energy that had started accumulating in him without anywhere to go. Christmas came and he gave her a gift, a small book he had ordered through Delbert Foss's general store, a copy of a novel she had mentioned once in passing that the minister's wife's library did not have. He brought it to her door on Christmas Eve, and she opened it and looked at it, and then looked at him with an expression that he had not quite seen on her face before, something unguarded and warm and a little undone. "How did you remember I mentioned this?" she said. "I remember most things you say," he said, which was truer than was comfortable. She had a gift for him as well, which she produced from inside the door, a new pair of work gloves, leather, well-fitted, which she had ordered through Foss, and had him measure against a trace of Milton's hand that she had taken an impression of one afternoon when he had left his old gloves on her porch rail during a repair he had offered to help with. The gloves were exactly right. He looked at the gloves and he looked at her. "Georgia," he said. "Milton," she said. Neither of them said the next thing, but they both knew what the next thing was, and they stood in her doorway on Christmas Eve with the cold stars overhead, and the sound of the Ray's family singing coming faintly from the north, and it was not nothing. It was, in fact, a great deal. He walked home that evening in the cold and put the gloves on and wore them the whole way, which was unnecessary, which he did not care about at all. January arrived. The cattle needed attention, and the South Creek had frozen at the edges, and there was a stretch of brutal cold in the second week that kept most people near their stoves. Milton went over to George's farm twice that week, without the occasion of cornbread, once to help move firewood that had frozen together in the stack and needed breaking apart, and once because he had been at his own stove and had thought about her being at hers alone, and had found himself not able to stay where he was. The second visit she opened the door and looked at him with a lamp in her hand and said, "I was just thinking about you." And he stepped inside out of the cold, and they had coffee, and he stayed for 2 hours talking about nothing in particular, which turned out to be a great deal. He was aware, sometime in those 2 hours, that he had stopped being afraid of this. Or rather, that the fear was still there. He could feel it, the old guarding instinct, the habit of not wanting, but that it had become smaller than the other thing, the Georgia-specific thing, which had quietly outgrown it without asking permission. He walked home in the dark thinking about that and about her, and about the fire, about Clara, and he allowed himself for the first time in 3 years to hold all of it at once, the grief and the new thing, and found that they could coexist in the same chest without one destroying the other. Clara had been real. The fire had been real. The loss was real and would always be real. And Georgia Turner was also real, and the way he felt when he was near her was real, and both of these truths could live in him without contradiction. This felt like something. He rode to town the next day and found Caleb at the livery and told him he was thinking about speaking to Georgia seriously, by which he meant his intentions. Caleb leaned against a stall post with his arms crossed and said nothing for a solid 5 seconds, which for Caleb was considerable restraint. Then he said, "You have been obvious for 2 months, Milton. She has been equally obvious for 2 months. I am glad someone is finally going to say something out loud." "She's been obvious," Milton said. "The cornbread, Milton. The cornbread is neighborly custom. She brings cornbread to one person on this earth," Caleb said, "and it is you, every Thursday morning before 6 o'clock, in November when it is cold." He looked at Milton with the patience of a man who has been waiting for a slow horse to figure out it can jump the fence. Rosa knew after the second delivery that this was not about being neighborly. Milton was quiet. "I didn't want to presume," he said. "I understand that," Caleb said, and his voice went a little gentler. "I know why you're careful. I know what you lost. But Milton, you've been punishing yourself for 3 years for surviving a fire that was not your fault, and this woman bakes you cornbread before sunrise every week and leaves it like a gift without asking for anything back, and if you don't," he stopped himself. "Just go talk to her," he said. "I was planning to," Milton said. "Good," Caleb said. "Tomorrow," Milton said. "Tonight," Caleb said. Milton looked at him. "Go tonight," Caleb said, "before you talk yourself out of it." He went that evening. He rode to George's farm in the January dark with the sky so full of stars it looked overcrowded, and he tied Clover at the post and knocked on the door, which he had done perhaps a dozen times, but never quite like this, never with his heart knocking louder than his hand. Georgia opened the door with her hair down. She had apparently been readying for bed and a lantern in her hand, and she looked at him with a question in her eyes and also something else, some readiness, as though she had been expecting him even though she could not have been. "Is something wrong?" she said. "No," he said. "I just I wanted to say something to you. I should have said it before now. I'm sorry it took me this long." She stood in the doorway with the lamplight warm on her face and waited. "I think you know that he started and stopped and tried again. "I have been careful about everything for a long time," he said. "I've been careful because I lost things and I didn't want to lose anything else, and so I decided the safest thing was to want nothing, to need nothing, to ask for nothing." He paused. "And then you put cornbread on my windowsill at some time before God gets up in the morning, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since that first day, and I have not been able to stop thinking about you, and I am standing here telling you this because Caleb told me to go tonight, and also because I was going to go tonight regardless of Caleb, and he stopped. "I am asking if you would be willing to let this become something between us." Something real and deliberate, and not just notes and cornbread. Though I hope the notes and cornbread continue, because they are among the best things in my day. Georgia Turner stood in her doorway for the length of several heartbeats, and her eyes were bright in the lamplight, and her expression was that unguarded, warm thing he had seen on Christmas Eve, fully present now without the restraint. "It already is something," she said quietly. "I think you know that." "I do," he said. "I wanted to say it out loud." "I'm glad you did," she said. He stood on her porch in the January cold with his hat in his hands again, and she looked at him. And then she reached out and took his hand, his left hand, the one with the scar on the knuckle from the fence repair, the hand with the new leather glove pushed back at the wrist, and she held it, and he held hers. And they stood like that for a long moment in the dark, with the stars overhead and the cold air clean around them, and something settled between them with the quiet finality of a thing that has found where it belongs. "You should probably come in," she said. "It's cold." "It is," he agreed, and stepped inside. She made coffee, and they sat at her kitchen table and talked until very late. And this time he told her more about Clara, about the fire, about the years after, not all at once and not easily, but honestly, in the way of a man who has decided the honesty is worth the cost. He told her that Clara had been 22 and that the fire had started from a lamp knocked over in a high wind, that he had been in the barn at the time, and by the time he had gotten to the house the roof was already gone, that he had not been able to save her, that this was the thing he had carried every day since. He told her about the road, about watching from the road. He told her the things he had not told anyone but Caleb, and they cost him something to tell, and she listened to every word with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes steady and present. When he finished, she said, "You did not start the fire." "I know that," he said. "You know it and you don't believe it," she said gently. "Those are different things." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "they are. The believing comes slower," she said. I think it takes someone standing next to you and saying it enough times that eventually it becomes real." "Is that an offer?" he said. "I think it might be," she said. He rode home at midnight under a sky brilliant with stars, and for the first time in 3 years he did not feel the particular weight he had been carrying everywhere, the weight of a life shaped around absence. He felt something lighter and more dangerous, and he was, for the first time in 3 years, glad about it. What followed was a courtship that Redemption Creek noted with approval and some invested interest, because small towns are always interested in the romantic arrangements of their members, and because Georgia Turner was well-liked, and Milton Sutton was understood to have had a hard time, and people were generally rooting for him in the way you root for something that has survived difficult weather. They rode out together on Sunday afternoons, because Sunday afternoons had no other obligation, and the hill country in winter was still beautiful, pale and dry and dramatic, with its limestone outcroppings and cedar, and the occasional hawk hanging in the cold, clear sky. They talked constantly. Georgia was curious about everything and had read more than most people in the county and was not shy about her opinions, and Milton found this endlessly interesting in the way that an honest engagement with a real mind is interesting. She challenged him on things. She pushed back when she disagreed. She laughed loudly when something was funny and did not perform delight she did not feel. He had not known how much he missed being with someone who was genuinely, specifically themselves, until he was with someone who was. He brought her wildflowers in February, which was an unconventional time for wildflowers because it was February in Texas. But he found them somehow small yellow things that bloomed impossibly early on the south face of a limestone hill, and brought them wrapped in his handkerchief. And she laughed and put them in a glass on the windowsill and kept them until they fell apart. She taught him how she made the cornbread, the particular ratio of coarse and fine cornmeal, the cast iron skillet heated before the batter went in, the slightly generous pour of buttermilk, one Thursday morning when he had come over early and stood in her kitchen while she worked. He watched her hands and the efficient movements of a woman who knows her kitchen, and he thought that he would like to watch her in this kitchen for a very long time, which was a thought he was no longer afraid of having. "You're going to ruin the mystique," he told her. "What mystique?" she said. "The cornbread mystique," he said. "It appears on my windowsill like a small miracle every Thursday, and now I'm going to know it's just a recipe." She looked at him over her shoulder with a kind of fond exasperation. "It was never just a recipe," she said. "No," he said, "I know." In March, something happened that changed the tenor of things temporarily, in the way events sometimes do when they force people to be direct about what they are to each other before they have quite finished deciding. There was a man from Bixar County named Webb Halcourt who came through Redemption Creek ostensibly on business related to land surveying for the railroad, which was a legitimate enough occupation. He was a polished sort of man, well-dressed for the territory, with a smooth manner, and a habit of directing his full charm at whichever woman in the room seemed most interesting. He arrived at the dusty spur, established himself at a table, and made himself agreeable to the town in the way of a man who wants information and knows that charm is the fastest way to it. Milton noticed him first at Sunday service, where the man had placed himself with geometric precision in the social architecture of the after-church yard next to Georgia Turner, and where Milton had to stand at a distance watching this man talk to Georgia with the particular attentive quality of someone deploying interest. Georgia was polite and not visibly impressed, but she was also too well-mannered to be actively dismissive. Milton was aware that he had no formal claim, that they had not had the direct conversation that would make formal claims possible. He was also aware that this awareness was not preventing him from feeling things that were distinctly territorial in nature, which he recognized as his own problem and not anyone else's. He crossed the yard. Georgia looked up when he arrived, and something in her face shifted, a brightness, an ease that she did not show Halcourt, and he noticed this, and it settled something in him. He introduced himself to Halcourt with civil correctness, and Halcourt assessed him in the rapid way of a man who deals in assessments, and Georgia said to Halcourt, "Mr. Sutton is my nearest neighbor and my close friend," with a particular emphasis on those last two words that was not accidental, and Halcourt, being a man who dealt in information, correctly read the information he had just been given. He excused himself shortly thereafter. Georgia turned to Milton and said, "That was necessary." "Was it?" he said. "He's been asking around about properties on the east side of town," she said, "specifically mine." "For the railroad," Milton said. "Possibly," she said. "Or possibly for private acquisition. Delbert Foss says he's been talking to a Denver land company. Some of these surveyor types are advanced men for land speculators." This was, as it turned out, accurate. Halcourt was in the employ of a land acquisition company based in Denver that had been quietly buying up parcels along potential railroad routes in central Texas, often approaching recent settlers, particularly women farming alone, with offers that were technically voluntary but backed by the implicit pressure of a company with lawyers and money, and a general indifference to individual circumstance. Milton was not surprised. The Wild West in 1882 was not short of men who made their money in the space between what was legal and what was decent, and railroad expansion brought all manner of opportunity and exploitation together in the same expanding tide. He also knew that Georgia's farm was her independence, and that her independence was not incidental to who she was but foundational to it, and that any threat to it was a threat to everything she had built in the 2 years since she had come here with her trunk and her seed box and her cast iron pans and her determination. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to tell him no," she said, clearly and in writing. "He may not accept a simple no," Milton said. "Then I'll find a lawyer," she said. "There's one in Fredericksburg who takes cases from people who can't afford much. Rosa told me about him." He looked at her, this woman who had come to Texas alone and built a life alone and was preparing to fight for it alone, as though that were simply the expected condition of things, and he felt something that was beyond affection, beyond the particular warmth she inspired in him. He felt a kind of fierce alignment, the feeling of being on someone's side all the way down. "Let me help," he said. She looked at him. "Milton." "Not in a way that takes it out of your hands," he said quickly. "You make the decisions, but I know people in Fredericksburg. I know the land registry process. I helped a man with a similar situation up near Careville 3 years back." Before he paused. "Before. I know how these companies work." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said. He met her eyes. "Because your farm is yours," he said, "and I would very much like it to continue to be yours for reasons that are—" He paused and then decided to be plain about it, which was the only thing he knew how to be with her. "For reasons that I think you understand." She looked at him for a long, clear moment. "Yes," she said, "I think I do." They handled Halcourt together, which meant Georgia handled Halcourt, and Milton made himself available for consultation and the occasional strategic presence. She wrote the refusal letter herself, in the clear, angular handwriting he knew from the Cornbread notes, and it was a remarkably good letter, specific about the legal standing of her property, calm about her intentions, and entirely without the apologetic hedging that such letters sometimes acquire when their writers are uncertain of their ground. Halcourt made one more approach, in person, at the general store, which Milton happened to be at. He was cordial and persistent, and vaguely suggested that an isolated woman farming alone might find her circumstances difficult without the goodwill of certain interests. Milton, who had been listening from the next aisle with increasing stillness, came around the shelves and said, quietly and without heat, that Miss Turner had legal title to her property, that she had said no clearly in writing, and that Redemption Creek was the kind of town that tended to remember how its people were treated. He said this in a factual tone, not aggressive, simply informational. Halcourt looked at Georgia, and then at Milton, and read the information correctly a second time, and left Redemption Creek the following morning. There was a satisfaction to this that Milton felt in his whole body, clean and simple, and having nothing to do with the minor confrontation and everything to do with standing next to her. He told Caleb about it that evening, and Caleb said, "When are you going to ask her to marry you?" "We haven't quite," Milton started. "You have," Caleb said. "You just haven't said the word yet. Go say the word." He thought about it for 2 days. He thought about it carefully, and without the fear that would have attended such thinking 3 months ago, because the fear had continued its diminishment, slowly and consistently, in Georgia Turner's specific presence. He thought about Clara, about what it meant to love someone and lose them, and what it meant to love someone again afterward. He had been told by a man on a cattle drive once, someone older and with his own losses, that loving again after loss was not a betrayal but a continuation, not a replacement but a return to the capacity for something real, and he had not been able to believe it then, but he believed it now, standing in this present January, now March, of his life, which was fuller and more surprising than anything he had been willing to hope for. He loved Georgia Turner. He had not quite said it to himself in exactly that order of words before, but there it was, and there was nothing to do but take it seriously. He went to her on a Saturday afternoon in late March, when the first real spring was beginning in the hill country, the bluebonnets coming in along the fence lines and the live oaks showing their new yellow-green, and the creek at the south of his property running clear and full from the winter rains. He asked her to walk with him down to the creek, which they had done before, and they went through the greening grass with the warm afternoon sun on their faces, and he was very aware of her beside him, the way she moved, the sound of her in the grass. At the creek he stopped, and she stopped, and the water went its way over the smooth limestone, and the bluebonnets were thick on the far bank, blue and particular and impossible-looking the way bluebonnets always are. He turned to face her. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it plainly, the way you deserve things to be asked." She was looking at him with full attention and something in her eyes that was quiet and sure. "I have been falling in love with you since the first Thursday morning when I found cornbread on my windowsill," he said. "I have been in love with you for some time now, and I think you know that. I have been—" He stopped and gathered. I had not let myself want anything in a long time. I had decided that wanting things was how you got hurt. And then you put that bread on my windowsill and I could not stop thinking about it. And I understand now that it was not really about the bread. It was about you deciding I was worth the gesture. And I want to spend. I want to give you something worth the gesture. Every day, if you'll let me. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring. A simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that he had bought from a silversmith in Fredericksburg on one of the trips there for Halcourt business planned even then, which suggested he had known where he was going even before he was willing to say so aloud. "Georgia Turner," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and she looked at him, and the creek made its way through the bluebonnets, and the afternoon light was gold on everything. "Yes," she said, "Milton Sutton, yes." He put the ring on her hand, and she looked at it with the unguarded warm expression that he loved on her. And then she looked up at him, and he kissed her for the first time, there by the spring creek with the bluebonnets and the gold light. And it was the kind of kiss that a person remembers not for its drama, but for its rightness, for the feeling of arriving somewhere after a long road and finding the door open. They were married in May of 1883 at the slightly left-leaning church in Redemption Creek, with Caleb standing up for Milton and Rosa standing up for Georgia, and 40 or 50 people from the town filling the pews because Redemption Creek was a town that showed up for its own, and also because people had been quietly invested in this particular outcome for several months and wanted to see it made official. Georgia wore a dress of cream muslin with blue trim that she and Rosa had made together over several Saturdays, and she wore her hair down with small blue flowers pinned in it, and she walked herself to the front of the church because there was no one to give her away, and she was not a woman who required giving. And Milton stood at the altar and watched her walk toward him and felt something so complete and present that it bypassed the language he usually applied to feelings and arrived directly as a physical truth, a warmth through the chest, a stillness, a certainty. The minister asked them both the necessary questions. They answered them clearly, looking at each other. When it was done and they were married, Georgia Turner Sutton leaned up and kissed her husband in the church, which made the assembled congregation respond with the kind of enthusiastic noise that suggested they had been waiting for that moment for some time. Rosa cried with great dignity. Caleb did not cry, but it was a close thing, and he would deny the close thing forever. The reception was in the community hall, with the San Antonio fiddle player back for a return engagement. And this time Milton and Georgia danced without the careful reserve of the November harvest dance, danced through the reel and a waltz and a second reel without much regard for grace, and laughed freely, and were happy. Milton Sutton was happy. The fact of this was so remarkable that he kept noting it, not in any melancholy way, not as a contrast to what had been, but simply as its own present truth. He was happy. He was in a room full of people who wished him well, dancing with a woman who made everything more alive and more worth attending to, and he was happy. They went home that evening, home to his farm, which had become their farm, Georgia moving her belongings over the week before the wedding, her trunk and seed box and cast iron pans now installed in the Sutton kitchen. And the night was warm and the stars were out, and they sat on the porch for a while and looked at the property, at the barn and the cattle and the fence line and the live oaks and the South Creek visible in the moonlight. And Georgia sat with her head on his shoulder and his arm around her, and neither of them said very much. "Happy," he said eventually. "Extremely," she said. "Good," he said, and pulled her a little closer. He had fixed the porch step months ago, and the roof and the well rope and the south fence. He had built a second room on the house in anticipation of exactly this, of a life that had more in it than one man's spare occupancy. He had not known for certain when he built it, but he had built it hopefully, which was, he now understood, the return of the wanting, the first acknowledgement, hammer in hand, that he was allowing himself to want things again. The second room was Georgia's sitting room now, with her books and her sewing basket and the chair she had brought from Virginia that had been her mother's, And seeing her things in his house made it a different kind of house, made it a home in a way it had not quite been, and he was glad of every board he had laid. Summer settled over Redemption Creek in the way of Texas summers, intense and absolute, a heat that required adaptation rather than resistance. And Milton and Georgia worked their joined properties through it with the particular satisfaction of two people whose efforts compound each other. Her kitchen garden expanded to supply both houses. His cattle herd grew to 23 head. They talked over supper every evening about the farm and the town and the books she was reading and the things he was thinking, and these conversations were, consistently, the best part of every day. She still made cornbread on Thursday mornings. Now she made it in their kitchen, in her cast iron skillet on their stove, and he still received it as a gift, still felt the warmth of it as something specific and chosen, even when he was standing 3 feet away watching her make it. She knew this and did not tease him about it very much, only a little, which was exactly the right amount. He told her about the fire again once more completely, on a night in July when a brush fire had started in the hills to the east of town, and everyone had turned out to fight it. And afterward he had come home shaking in a way that was not from exertion, and she had held him on the porch while the smoke smell faded in the night air and told him things were not burning. The farm was safe. She was here. He told her then all of it, every piece he had not yet told, and she listened to all of it, and when he was finished she said, "You are here. We are here. The farm is here, and you did not lose it tonight." And then she said quietly, "You are allowed to have built something again, Milton. You are allowed to have this." He held on to those words for a long time afterward and found eventually that he believed them, which was the thing that had been missing for 3 years. The believing. In September of 1883, Georgia told him she was expecting their first child. He was in the barn when she told him, mending a harness, and she came in with her hands in her apron pockets and told him plainly, the way she told him most things, looking directly at him. He set down the harness. He crossed the barn in about 3 steps and took her face in both hands, his big scarred-knuckled hands, and looked at her. And she was looking back at him with that unguarded warm expression. And he said, "Georgia," just her name, and she said, "I know." And he kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then held her for a long moment in the dusty gold light of the barn with the horses shuffling and the late September warmth coming in through the gaps in the boards. He went into town the next day and told Caleb, who was so visibly delighted that he knocked over a bucket in the livery out of sheer, misdirected enthusiasm. Rosa came over that week with baby clothes she had saved from her own children, and told Georgia everything she needed to know about pregnancy and childbirth in Texas in 1883, which was both reassuring and practical, and Georgia took notes in the angular handwriting that Milton loved. The town doctor, a wiry, methodical man named Dr. Haynes, who had come down from Illinois, and who seemed to find everything about Texas slightly surprising but was excellent at his job, confirmed the pregnancy and declared Georgia healthy and unconcerned, which was all the reassurance Milton required at any given moment, though he required it somewhat frequently. Georgia found this endearing and told him so. He told her he was not sure endearing was the word for it. She said it was exactly the word for it, and went back to her mending. Winter came again, and with it the second harvest dance, which they attended as a married couple and danced through without any of the careful uncertainty of the first time, dancing the way people dance when they know each other, and the music is good, and the room is warm, and there is nowhere else they want to be. Georgia was beginning to show, and Rosa danced with her in the reel, and the other women gathered around her with the particular warmth that a community extends to an impending new member, and Milton watched her from across the room and felt the same thing he had felt watching her walk into the church in May, that full present warmth, that certainty. He crossed the room and put his hand on the small of her back, and she leaned into him barely, naturally, the way you lean into something you trust, and they stood together and watched the dancing. "Same question as last year," he said quietly. She looked up at him. "Ask it." "Happy." "So much," she said. The winter passed in the warmth of their particular life. The farm's rhythms, the Thursday cornbread now a domestic ritual rather than a mystery, the evenings by the stove with Georgia reading, aloud from whatever the minister's wife had lent her, while Milton carved small things from cedar, a hobby he had picked up from a man in Careville, and that produced results of varying quality, which Georgia received with consistent generosity. He finished a small cedar box in February that he was genuinely pleased with, smooth-sided, with a simple carved flower on the lid that he had practiced for 2 weeks, and gave it to her without ceremony on a Tuesday evening, handing it across the table. She opened it and looked at the inside, and then at the flower on the lid and at him, and she put all her cornbread notes in it, the little pieces of paper from the early winter of their knowing each other, and closed the lid and set it on her dresser next to the ring box. He saw it there later and felt something he could not quite name, but that was entirely good. Their son was born in April of 1884, on an afternoon that started with a spring rainstorm and ended with the sky cleared to a particular clean blue that Milton would always associate afterward with this day. Dr. Haynes was there, and Rosa, and the birth was not easy. There was a stretch of several hours in the late morning that was frightening in the particular suspended way of things you cannot fix or hurry. But Georgia came through it with a kind of fierce determination that would have surprised no one who knew her, and the child arrived at 2 in the afternoon, substantial and loud. Milton was in the yard when Rosa opened the door and said, "Come in, Milton. You have a son." And the way he walked through that door was different from any walking he had ever done. Georgia was propped up in bed looking like herself, but somehow more so tired and bright and definite, and she held out the bundle to him, and he took his son for the first time, this small absolute creature, and stood beside the bed and could not say anything at all for a moment. "He has your brow," Georgia said. "He has your mouth," Milton said, which was true, the determined set of it already visible even in the first minutes. "What will we call him?" Georgia said. They had discussed names. They had a list. But looking at his son in his arms with Georgia watching him from the bed, Milton said the name they had both privately been leaning toward without quite committing to. "Thomas," he said, "after your brother." Georgia's face did something complicated and warm. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said. "I know," he said. Thomas Sutton was a healthy, demanding, frequently loud baby who organized the entire farm around his requirements within about 3 days and showed no signs of negotiating. He had Georgia's directness and Milton's stubbornness, and both of these qualities in combination were, Milton reflected, both a challenge and a deep satisfaction. He spent more time than he could account for just watching his son, watching him sleep, watching him discover his own hands, watching him achieve the developmental milestones that Dr. Haynes described with scientific dispassion, but which Milton experienced as events of considerable magnitude. He wrote to Thomas's namesake uncle in Virginia, a letter he had helped Georgia compose carefully, about the baby and the farm and Redemption Creek, and the life they had made, and the letter that came back 3 weeks later from Thomas Turner was warm and full of feeling, and included a pressed flower from the Shenandoah Valley that Georgia held for a long time before pressing it flat in her book. She cried a little quietly, and Milton sat beside her on the porch step with his arm around her until she was finished, and then she said, "I am not sad," and he said, "I know," and she leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in the April evening with the baby asleep inside, and the bluebonnets coming in along the fence line and the creek running clear. Summer came again, and Thomas grew with the speed that babies demonstrate, which never stops being astonishing. By fall he was sitting up and regarding the world with a focused seriousness that made Caleb say he looked just like his father, which Milton took as a compliment even though Caleb might have meant it partially otherwise. Georgia's farm had been fully incorporated into their shared operation now. The fence between the two properties opened up to allow movement between them. Her kitchen garden expanded and thriving, her milk cow part of their small herd. They had hired a young man from town, a 17-year-old named Pete who was 18 within a month of hiring, the son of one of the ranchers, who needed work and who had a good instinct for cattle, to help with the expanded operation. And Pete arrived every morning at 7 and left at 6 and addressed both of them as Mr. and Mrs. Sutton with great earnestness and was generally good company. Life in Redemption Creek continued its pattern of the mostly ordinary, punctuated by the occasional event that required a town's full attention. In the spring of 1885, the railroad spur was extended further west, which brought new business and new complications in roughly equal measure, and Redemption Creek navigated the complications with the pragmatism of a town that had already seen several versions of change and knew it would see several more. There were conversations in town about the Comanche families who had been pushed off their traditional lands in the years before and during the settlers' expansion through this part of Texas. An injustice that had compounded across decades, the displacement of people from land they had lived on for generations, forced onto reservation land through a combination of military force and treaty violations. Milton and Georgia talked about this, seriously and with discomfort, because the farm they lived on and the town they lived in were built on that history, and being honest about it mattered even when the honesty provided no clean resolution. Milton had known an older Comanche man once, years before the fire, who had spoken about the land with a relationship to it that Milton had never quite been able to forget, a different kind of knowing, older and less transactional. And he thought about it sometimes when he stood at the South Creek and looked at the limestone hills and understood that this place had a history longer than his own arrival in it. The conversations did not solve the larger injustice, which was beyond any individual's capacity to solve. But they were the kind of conversations Georgia insisted on having because she believed that looking clearly at things, even difficult things, was a form of respect for truth, and Milton had come to share this belief, as he had come to share many of her convictions through the simple, persistent influence of living close to a person who held them with integrity. Thomas turned 2 in April of 1886 and developed strong opinions about horses, particularly Clover, who was elderly now and very tolerant of small persons who approached her without adequate preparation. He could say approximately 30 words, most of them correctly applied, and had developed a passion for following Pete around the farm that Pete handled with the earnest patience of a 19-year-old who was somewhat flattered by the attention. In the summer of 1886, Georgia told Milton she was expecting again. He was in the kitchen this time, washing up after supper, and she told him from across the table with her hands flat on the wood, and he turned around with the water still on his hands and crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, the way he had crossed the barn 2 years before, and she stood up to meet him and he held her there in the kitchen while Thomas babbled something from his chair and the lamp burned low and the summer night came in through the open window. 2, he said. 2, she agreed. Thomas is going to be insufferable about it, he said. Thomas is going to be wonderful about it, she said. He'll adjust. He will, Milton said. He's your son. He's your son too, she said. He has my stubbornness, Milton said. He has your everything else that makes it manageable. She laughed, there in his arms, and the sound of it went through him like warm water. The second child was born in February of 1887, in the coldest month they had had in several years, which Dr. Haynes managed with his usual methodical competence, and Rosa received with equal parts warmth and efficiency. Georgia, again, was extraordinary. Milton was learning that she was simply extraordinary as a baseline, which she did not require him to observe aloud, though he did so regularly. Their daughter came into the world in the blue early morning of a February Wednesday, smaller than Thomas had been but equally determined, with Georgia's dark hair and eyes so strikingly similar to Milton's gray-green that Dr. Haynes noted it with scientific interest. "Clara," Georgia said when Milton looked at her. He looked up. "I was thinking if you're willing," Georgia said. "Clara." He was quiet for a moment, holding his daughter, feeling the particular weight of the name in the room. He had told Georgia everything about Clara, about the kind of woman she had been, and Georgia had listened the way she always listened, completely, and had said afterward that the loss was real and should stay real, and that honoring it did not diminish what they had. He had known, hearing her say that she was right, and that he loved her more specifically for understanding. He looked down at his daughter, this new particular person who was entirely herself and carried nobody's story but her own. "Clara," he said quietly. "Yes." Georgia held out her arms for the baby and he placed her there. This small daughter with her gray-green eyes and her future entirely ahead of her. And Georgia held her close, and Milton sat on the edge of the bed and took Georgia's hand. And they were quiet together in the early morning light, while the cold outside did what cold does in February in Texas, and they were warm inside with their children and each other. Thomas met his sister that afternoon with the gravity of a nearly 3-year-old who has been prepared for this event over several months and has developed a theory about it. He looked at her very seriously in George's arms and said, with absolute conviction, "Small." Georgia and Milton and Rosa, who was present, all agreed that this was accurate, and Thomas seemed satisfied with this consensus, and accepted his sister with the pragmatic goodwill that would, over the years, become the characteristic shape of his relationship with her. Spring came, as it always did, with the bluebonnets and the creek and the new growth, and the Sutton farm ran its fields and its cattle and its Thursday mornings with the cornbread that was now a family ritual, Thomas sometimes standing on a chair to watch his mother work the batter, getting flour on his face, and Milton always receiving his portion with the particular attention he had given it since the very beginning. Since the cold November morning when he had found a cloth-wrapped bundle on his windowsill and stood in his kitchen in his stocking feet, holding the small, warm mystery of someone's kindness, and found that he could not stop thinking about it. He still could not stop thinking about it. Not in the troubled way of those first weeks, but in the way you think about a thing that changed everything with recognition and with gratitude. He thought about it one Thursday morning in the April of 1887, Clara 4 months old and asleep in the cradle he had built, which was considerably better work than his first cedar box, and Thomas at the table with a piece of cornbread in each hand for reasons that seemed logical to him, and Georgia at the stove with her hair coming loose from its knot and her apron on, and the skillet heating in the particular way he knew, and the spring light coming in through the east window, the same window where the cornbread had appeared that first November morning so many seasons ago. He sat at the table and watched her and thought about the road he had traveled to get here, the fire and the years after, the empty places he had built into himself to keep from needing things, the long, careful way back to Redemption Creek, the 12 acres and the broken porch step and the 300 yards east, the first Thursday and the cloth and the twine and the warmth of the bread in his hands, and everything that had come after. He thought about all of it, and he was not afraid of any of it, which was itself a kind of miracle. Georgia turned from the stove and saw him looking at her and said, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "You have a face," she said. "I have several," he said. "Which one?" "The one you get when you're thinking about something you're not going to say until later," she said. He smiled. "Later, then," he said. She brought the cornbread to the table and sat across from him, and Thomas immediately reached for her portion, and she redirected him with the efficient calm of a mother who has accepted that negotiating with a nearly 3-year-old is simply the condition of the enterprise. Clara made a sound from the cradle. The stove ticked. The spring light moved. Later that evening, after the children were put to bed, Thomas with a story, Clara with the particular rocking and singing combination that she responded to, he found Georgia on the porch in the spring dark, looking out at the property, and he sat beside her in the other chair, and they were quiet for a while in the comfortable way of two people who have been quiet together long enough to know its quality. "All right," she said. "What were you thinking this morning?" He looked out at the dark land, at the fence line and the oak stand, and the faint shine of the South Creek in the moonlight. He thought about the road, about the years, about the fire and everything after. "I was thinking about what I would have missed," he said quietly. "If I had stayed gone, if I had kept deciding not to want things." He paused. "You," he said. "Thomas, Clara, this." He gestured, a small gesture that took in the porch and the farm and the night. "All of it. I would have missed all of it." Georgia was quiet. "And I was thinking," he said, "about that first Thursday morning. The cornbread. How I stood in the kitchen holding it and I could not stop thinking about it. About someone doing something kind in the early dark, without asking anything back. I had arranged myself so carefully not to feel anything, and one small thing went through all of it like a light through a crack." He stopped. "I've been meaning to tell you properly for a long time, what it meant, what it started." Georgia turned to look at him in the dark, and he could see her face in the moonlight, that strong-jawed, clear-eyed face he had been looking at for years now and still found more interesting than anything else. "I knew what I was doing," she said quietly. "The first time, it was impulse. But the second Thursday I knew, I just didn't have a language for it yet." "The cornbread was the language," he said. "I suppose it was," she said. He took her hand, the one with the ring that had been on it for 4 years now, the turquoise gone a little darker with time and wear, and held it in both of his in the spring night. "Thank you," he said, "for leaving it, for not knocking, for the notes, for all of it." She leaned over and put her head on his shoulder in the way she always did, easy and certain, and his arm came around her in the way it always did. And they sat like that on their porch on their farm in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1887, with their children asleep inside, and the stars out, and the bluebonnets coming in along the fence line, and it was everything. He was 42 when their third child was born, in the fall of 1892, and he had been a rancher and a husband and a father for long enough that his hands were deeply scarred, and his hair had gone gray at the temples, and he had developed an opinion about nearly every piece of land in a 30-mile radius that Caleb found simultaneously useful and amusing. Georgia was 35 and running a kitchen garden that had become something close to legendary in the county, supplying not only their household but a good portion of the Tuesday market in town. And she had become the kind of woman that people brought their problems to, not for authority, but for the quality of her listening and the practical honesty of her counsel. Thomas was 8 and had his father's build and his mother's mind, and was already, per the schoolteacher, the student she would most like to clone for the purposes of educational efficiency. Clara was 5 and was, per everyone's assessment including her own, exactly as much as anyone could handle, which she appeared to regard as a compliment. The third child was a boy, and they named him James, after no one in particular, and for no reason other than that it was a solid name that sounded well with Sutton. And he arrived in October with the fall pecans and the harvest, and the particular quality of Texas October that makes the whole world look gold-lit and worth staying in. Milton held James in the first hour of his life, and looked at his face and thought about the road, about the fire, about the man he had been riding into Redemption Creek 12 years ago with his hat pulled low and his heart arranged for absence. And he thought that if that man could see him now standing in a warm room with his third child and his extraordinary wife and the smell of cornbread still on the air from this morning's Thursday, he would not have believed it possible. But it was possible. It was what had happened. It was, in every ordinary, extraordinary particular, his life. Georgia recovered well and was back to the kitchen garden within a month, which Dr. Haynes said was typical for her constitution, meaning that she was built for persistence, which everyone already knew. Caleb and Rosa came over for supper the following Sunday, bringing their own youngest who had been born the same year as Thomas and who was Thomas's closest friend. And the house was full of children and noise and tamales, and Milton sat at the head of his table looking down its length at Georgia at the other end. James in her arms and Clara talking over someone else's sentence, and Thomas, gesturing about something with a fork in a way that suggested he had inherited his father's tendency toward physical punctuation. And he felt the full weight of the room, the specific warmth of it, the love in it, which was not a word he had used for a very long time before he had learned to use it again. He caught George's eye across the table. She looked at him over James's sleeping head with the expression he had loved for 9 years, the unguarded warm one, the one she had when she was most completely herself. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She knew what he was feeling because she was feeling it too, and they had had enough practice in the language of each other's silences to be fluent in them by now. Caleb caught this exchange and said nothing, which meant he was saving it for later. Rosa caught it and smiled into her tamale. After supper, after the children were settled and the Reyeses had gone home, after the kitchen was clean and the baby was down, Milton found Georgia on the porch again. It was always the porch, had been the porch since that first spring, which was not an accident. The porch was where they came back to, and he sat beside her in the October night, and the stars were out, brilliant and many, and the air smelled like cedar and cool earth. "Same question," he said. She laughed softly, and it was the laugh he had first heard at the harvest dance in 1882, the one that did not perform itself, the real one. She had been laughing it for 12 years now, and it had not lost anything, not a single thing. "Same answer," she said. He took her hand. The creek ran at the south edge of the property. The cattle were settled in for the night. The live oaks stood where they had always stood. The farm was theirs, hers and his, built together from their separate starts, from her trunk and seed box and his saddlebag and bedroll, from the careful, patient work of two people who had each decided once to stop wanting things and had each, eventually, been persuaded back into the wanting by something small and warm and given without condition. The cornbread still came on Thursday mornings. It would always come. That was simply the shape of things now, the first gesture grown into a ritual, grown into a life, the way all the best things grow, from one small specific act of reaching toward another person in the early dark, before the world is properly awake, and leaving something good on their windowsill and trusting that they will find it. He had found it. He had found all of it, here in this hill country town under these particular stars, with this particular woman beside him on this particular porch, in the life he had finally, fully, allowed himself to want.